I'm Caldwell-Gervais. In this video I'm going to be looking at three very different zombie games. Left 4 Dead 2 for its multiplayer component, Dying Light for the way it uses a City of the Dead in a way that other games never have before, and Telltale's Walking Dead series for how it uses human drama in a way that other games that are gameplay focused do not. It's the same monster in all three games, but all three games couldn't really be more different from each other in terms of gameplay format. So let's look into how all three are successful.
Zombies have been one of this century's great pop cultural preoccupations so far, and it's not hard to see why. It's an apocalypse scenario where our entire consumer culture literally eats itself, and where the things that define our humanity at its most basic level come into sharp and savage focus. The zombie apocalypse is a way of tearing away all the things we see as necessary to modern life, our conveniences and our manicured self-presentations, and asks how it would be if we were all wounded, starving animals sitting in the crumbling ruins of the world we've wrought. As sick to death as many people are of zombies, zombie movies, zombie books, zombie games, zombie t-shirts, zombies the breakfast cereal, the themes that get explored in a zombie apocalypse are wonderfully wide-ranging and complex. A lot of zombie media just regurgitates the same rhythms and cliches over and over again, particularly movies, who have to establish and wrap up the whole story in 2 hours' time. But major exceptions are easy to find. It's no wonder that some of the best pieces of zombie media are the ones that have experimented the most with format, like Zombieland and Shaun of the Dead, which refuse to take the apocalypse seriously, or The Walking Dead, both in comics and on TV, whose extended length allows it to explore the apocalypse in incredible depth and detail. Zombies remain the same between different pieces of media, excepting the slow zombie versus fast zombie split, but the way a piece of media chooses to explore the monster and the apocalypse can vary enormously. This video looks at 3 zombie apocalypse games with completely different formatting styles, and how they explore the setting in ways that are completely unique from each other. We'll start with Left 4 Dead 2, Valve's flagship multiplayer zombie survival title. While zombies have been in games since the very beginning, the first Left 4 Dead arguably kicked off the trend of fast-paced, fast zombie multiplayer shoot-'em-ups that continues today with titles like Killing Floor 2. Left 4 Dead 2 is still one of the top titles in the subgenre, though, and I think the reason is clear. It's the most tightly designed, well-balanced, and charismatically replayable of the bunch. The second game expanded quite a bit on the first in terms of items and the scope of its levels, and in the years since its release, Left 4 Dead 2 has added imports of all the first game's levels and several new, smaller campaigns. If you're unfamiliar, here's what Left 4 Dead is all about. You have a set of 4 survivors trying to progress through miniature campaigns that last an hour or so, with several long levels topped off by a climactic escape sequence, where the survivors have to hold off enormous hordes as help arrives by some means, plane, helicopter, etc. The zombies are fast, and the survivors have a wide variety of assault rifles, submachine guns, shotguns, rifles, pistols, bombs, Molotov cocktails, axes, swords, and frying pans with which to decapitate, dismember, and smack around the zombie hordes. Each mini-campaign has between 800 and 1,800 zombies to kill, plus special infected, which can incapacitate individual survivors and necessitate a helping hand from the rest of the group. Survivors can share health kits and other items between each other, and receive bonuses for protecting each other and reviving each other when health runs out. While you can play this game alone with 3 AI companions, there's no point, and it's quite difficult. You can't survive without help in Left 4 Dead 2. Cooperation is the name of the game. The survivor group is the foundation of every single zombie story, from Night of the Living Dead right on down the line. Left 4 Dead 2 is notable because it relies on players to form their own emotional bonds and relate to the survivor group on a round-by-round basis. Each round is a new story played out on top of a predetermined template. The survivors themselves as characters are little more than brief sketches and broad characterizations that come through in intermittent canned dialogue. While each mini-campaign has its own flow, its own goals and struggles, it's hard to say that any of them really have a plot. Left 4 Dead 2 includes many references and nods to other pieces of zombie media, but never tries to directly copy any static, Hollywood-style storytelling. It's part of the game's success. Such an incredibly minimal presentation of character and plot makes it much easier to bear the repetition of the game. You're meant to play these campaigns over and over and over again, and everything, and I do mean everything in the game, comes back around to making this repetition enjoyable. The characters are not very distinct from one another, so it doesn't really matter which one you play as when you join a game. You might like one voice actor better than another, but they all fade into the background of screams and gunfire just the same. And yet, despite pretty much rejecting plot and character at a fundamental level, it's one of the best zombie games there is. It's one of the only zombie games that tries to foster feelings of protectiveness and companionship between players themselves, even if they're total strangers. What plot and dialogue there is has kind of a flippant, comedic tone to it, and this further encourages player cooperation. There's no distrust or antipathy between survivors. Their dialogue is good-natured and indicative of a good time being had, and so there's a light push for the players to follow suit. The game is partially procedurally generated. Item placement and zombie placement is determined by an AI director, which tries to challenge the group when it's doing well and gives little moments of respite when they're down on their luck. It's a great balance. Each round does feel distinct, despite the levels never changing architecturally. When a survivor is invisible, you can still see their outlines through walls, so if a member of your group gets lost, you can go back and guide them, or if your point man is overwhelmed, support can come quickly. The interface and the way the game presents itself all make it easy to work as a team, even if no one is using a microphone. Characters will use can dialogue to call for aid from other places if they need it, no player input required. It all works so well, despite some effort from players to subvert it. You can damage other players, but it's something you're supposed to avoid. However, I would find that another player took some kind of issue with me, "you set me on fire" being the most common one, and would spend the rest of the game trying to kill me until I left the game, or waiting until the climactic finale and then killing everyone in the evacuation area so that they're the only person to technically complete the campaign. Petty stuff. Other times, I would be kicked out of games seconds after joining, for reasons I can only really guess at. It's to the game's great credit that this sort of fun-sapping bullshit is rare. The game itself is built in a way that encourages friendly cooperation, and almost everyone in the community is really on point, to a much, much higher degree than antagonistic multiplayer zombie apocalypses like DayZ. By going through a whole hour of play with the same 3 other people, our difficulties and triumphs felt tangible and meaningful, and the hour of play a campaign takes fits into the time that people have for gaming extremely well. These elements of casual play, the lighthearted tone, the momentum of the action, all of them draw in players who might not ordinarily play a multiplayer first-person shooter like Left 4 Dead 2. Out of all zombie apocalypses, in fact, Left 4 Dead 2 has one of the friendliest. It's a land of plenty. Plenty of guns, plenty of ammo, plenty of zombies, but then again, you've got plenty of help. It's the apocalypse in the form of a competition, the end of the world with a definitive high score at the end. It's what zombies look like, with a completely gamified presentation. And they're a lot of fun this way. It completely lacks the exploration of humanity that goes hand in hand with zombies as monsters in other mediums and in other games, but it does what traditional mediums cannot, and connects you, automatically and swiftly, to other real-live humans with whom you can experience the thrills and shocks of living in the world of the dead. In this way, your Survivor experience is authentic to the player in a very meaningful way. You're given all the tools you could possibly want to kill zombies the way that most tickles your fancy, and a set of like-minded strangers to do your killing alongside. Shotguns for getting right up close, rifles for knocking them down like dominoes from a distance, and automatic weapons for cutting down waves of running, ravenous zombies. You can be generous with items and cover the group, or a miser and a loner running off ahead to find the best items. You can bash zombies over the head with a wickedly large amount of melee weapons, ranging from guitars to fire axes. Your behavior and specialties are your own. You're playing yourself, sort of, even though the 4 survivors are characters of a kind. You can see this interplay of inventory and personality in how most players have a kind of manners regarding thrown weapons. Almost universally, when a player tosses a pipe bomb, which attracts zombies to it and then explodes spectacularly, other players cease fire and let that player get as many kills as possible. Hard to say if it's courtesy or tactical prudence. The game allows for both approaches to work equally well. But the rhythm of combat, the random variations in item placement and zombie placement, the minimalism of the story elements, and the quick companionship all come together to create a very pure video game experience, almost endlessly repeatable without sacrificing enjoyment or playability. Of course, even the most satisfying systems aren't enjoyable in repetition unless the environment you're doing it in is well designed. This is the thing that makes Left 4 Dead 2, especially now that it contains all the maps from the first game, stand out so much from other multiplayer zombie shooters. The level design is consistently, outrageously fantastic. Rather than having some kind of epic plot, each mini-campaign takes on a particular theme and explores it in exhaustive detail. The shopping mall, the airport, the swamp, the carnival. Linking each of these places by expository plot is a chore that the game avoids. Each is presented as a singular story, although they are all tied in a loosely linear way. You experience each place briefly but intensely each time through, a kind of apocalyptic Disneyland where everything is scaled down to deceptively small proportions. Each mini-campaign has an interplay of wide-open streets and plazas with claustrophobic labyrinthine routes through dark and derelict urban sprawl. There are some levels that try to tackle outdoor areas, and they are noticeably less successful. Your inability to truly explore the wild areas outside narrow corridors makes them feel much more artificial than the urban areas, which hide the seams of their design much more carefully. A fun exception to this is the most recent campaign, a one-level short called Cold Stream, developed by the Steam community and made official by Valve. It's an extremely narrow, linear fight through a stream bed to reach a helicopter on the other side. It's the simplest map there is in the entire game, point A to point B, no deviations. But it distills the game's combat down to its most basic features. Point your guns forward and let the zombies come screaming toward you infinitely. It's all about funneling the maximum strategically manageable amount of zombies at the survivors in the shortest amount of time. In the rest of the game, this is done with an elastic, unpredictable rhythm as the level architecture subtly funnels the players forward and the game's AI director gives the players enough challenge to bottom out their resources, then enough slack to replenish, then another series of challenges to bottom them out again. Here, there is no reprieve. It is one level of relentless forward motion. Initially, I kind of wondered why this had been made an official edition, and then I understood it as an intense distillation of the gameplay as a whole. In Left 4 Dead 2, zombies are more mechanic than monsters. There is very little actual horror. The apocalypse is a playground. It is still one of the very best zombie games because it explores the fundamental struggle of this particular end-of-the-world scenario so well. The tension between an infinite horde of the undead, unthinking monsters and the very few living beings still able to outrun and outthink them. The game provides a platform for instant gratification of that dynamic. You plug in the setting you want, the difficulty you want, choose the weapon you want, and team up with 3 other people who are trying to spend their free time this way. It is the zombie apocalypse, a la carte. Now we're going to look at Dying Light, a contemporary, single-player-focused, open-world zombie apocalypse that provides, in my opinion, one of the most vivid presentations in gaming of a world in the process of adapting to the zombie plague, stoically and defiantly living alongside the dead instead of in direct opposition with them. Don't get me wrong, you're still a lean, mean zombie-killing machine, but the path you walk to get there is longer, more treacherous, and more delightfully complicated than anything in Left 4 Dead. It's a long game. I spent 46 hours with it, and I didn't play any of the DLC. It spends about 10 of those hours describing the world to you and telling you stories in it, and then about 36 hours letting you live in the world and figure things out for yourself. Ultimately, Dying Light is just as much of a gameplay-focused title as Left 4 Dead, despite its occasional forays into big-budget cinematic presentation. However, everything about the expression of the focus is different. Dying Light is a game about living with the dead, and progressing in competence, to where you experience zombies as genuine monsters at first, and then as common obstacles as time goes on and familiarity increases. And it's a game about going native. Unlike most zombie media, it doesn't take place in the US. Instead, it takes place in the fictional city of Haran, which has an ambiguously Near Eastern quality to it. Fundamentally, you've only got 2 large neighborhood maps, with a few dozen interior maps and 1 large extra outdoor area. That seems like an awful small space to stretch 46 hours into. It isn't. The amount of time you spend familiarizing yourself with Haran is one of the game's greatest immersive hooks. Like Left 4 Dead, there are a lot of repetitive elements in the gameplay systems, and many of those systems are randomized in a similar way. However, the focus is on scavenging resources to avoid the zombies, saving what you craft for difficult situations that you do have to advance through to accomplish the missions. Everything in Dying Light is exceptionally finite, except the zombies. In Left 4 Dead, the AI director has a mandate to keep the players stocked so that they never really slow down, so that they always feel powerful enough to continue. Dying Light is classic survival horror against an open-world backdrop, using inventory and an unforgiving difficulty to maintain constant tension, and, eventually, an extremely tangible sense of triumph and progression. Also, unlike Left 4 Dead, it cares a lot about traditional character-driven storytelling, even when the weight of that storytelling drags the game down. The main plot of Dying Light is incredibly cliché and predictable, and if it were a movie, it would be a pretty bad one. Dying Light is still a great game, though. The experience of surviving Haran on a block-by-block, real-time basis is completely enthralling. The story setup goes like this. Haran has been quarantined following the outbreak of the zombie plague. The global relief effort sends you in as a special operatives to acquire some sensitive documents and locate the whereabouts of the man they suppose is running Haran. You're flown in, but bit immediately, and then rescued at the expense of another man's life. The bite is not an immediate death sentence, though. There's a treatment that can keep the infection at bay for a time, so you're immediately indebted to the survivor community who rescued you. Your first long afternoon in Haran is spent helping the community, tucked inside of a barricaded skyscraper. Characters teach you the mechanics of the game in charismatically storified tutorial missions. When you've learned enough, you are let out the front doors of the skyscraper and given free reign over a modern-day kingdom of the dead. The afternoon lasts as long as you need to get the hang of the game and complete a couple tasks out in the zombie-filled slums. Then the game's final, most distinctive mechanic kicks in: Nightfall, and the seemingly unstoppable terrors that come with it. The regular zombies are on their way to becoming something even worse, weird, fierce hunters that you won't be a match for until the very latest hours of the game. They congregate in hidden underground spaces during the day. You can even find them there in caves, hibernating until dusk. Then they swarm out like bats, and their cone of vision is marked on your minimap. Once they catch wind of you, all you can really do is run. If you can reach a safe house, you can wait until morning. UV lights are the only weakness of the monsters, and they'll stay away from UV light fixtures around safe houses and distributed as traps throughout the city. Experience progression is doubled at night. High risk, high reward, and a beautiful way to frame the entire rhythm of play. The bright light of the morning and early afternoon give an impression of great potential for a whole day of zombie dodging, crafting material gathering fun. As the afternoon wears on, the light yellows, then grows orange, and finally begins to fade to night. The technical beauty of the lighting mechanics is incredibly noteworthy. The light gradients change so gradually that it's almost imperceptible, and the emotional conditioning, the tension inherent in oncoming inevitable danger, really picks up the slack in what could otherwise be a somewhat repetitive crafting and combat game. If you get stuck on a task, you see the light slowly bleed away. You've got to decide, retreat and try again tomorrow, or risk it all so your time isn't wasted. Dying Light doesn't have a static rhythm to its horror and its tension. It's systemic and cyclical, game systems providing emotional cues and constructing an experience that places the player inside of an undead ecosystem, towards the bottom instead of the top, with an internal rhythm of difficulty that constantly shifts. This is where the game shines. This is where its compulsive playability stems from. The plot is entirely inconsequential. It's not just inconsequential, actually, it's an eye-rolling drag throughout most main campaign missions. Would you guess that the GRE are actually the bad guys? Would you guess that the man you're looking for runs a rival skyscraper and is a homicidal, power-drunk despo? Would you guess that the game makes a big to-do about developing friendships with characters for the sole purpose of having a no moment? Not once, but like 3 times. If you had a round of zombie cliché bingo for Dying Light, it would be an intensely competitive game. The biggest problem is that the plot takes itself very seriously and uses high-production cutscenes to relay a convoluted narrative that most people figure out in the first 15 minutes. The setting is so well thought out, the maps are so meticulously constructed, and the gameplay is so rewarding. Why do they rely on such a derivative mishmash for the narrative? It's an even bigger puzzle when you consider that a huge number of side quests are written quite sharply. Their tones are different. Some emphasize horror, some emphasize dexterity, some are comedic, some are incredibly dark. Ultimately, Dying Light just does better with vignette storytelling than with a linear narrative, and it makes more sense in terms of who you are in the game world and how that world is constructed. Most of the folks you meet in Dying Light are broadly characterized and kind of ridiculous, but their struggle is real, man. Regardless of iffy dialogue, each of Harran's inhabitants is portrayed as a living part of the city, people who have had to deal with the zombie problem much longer than you, and who have all adapted to the situation in vibrantly creative ways. Walled communities, deranged loners, crafty alcoholics, predatory businessmen, they're all out there, all facing the exact same dangers as you. Occasionally, you even get randomly generated interactions, encountering other survivors in trouble who can choose to help or ignore. It all comes together to accomplish something slightly unusual in games. Dying Light gives the player the impression that they are not the center of attention, that they are one among many and a peer. In a lot of ways, this is why the self-seriousness and predictability of the plot really interferes with the game. The narrative of the gameplay is one of being a small part of a larger, grotesque ecosystem, to eventually become at home within it. The vignette narratives of the side quests are all about the communal struggle of the citywide survivor group and their refusal to yield their humanity. The explicit expositional narrative is one of rivalry, betrayal, and the special uniqueness of the player. It hits a contradictory note, and since the other 2 methods of storytelling through vignettes and game mechanics occupy a much larger amount of your time investment in the game than the main plot does, the bad note rings especially loudly. There's one bit to the story that is pretty damn unique, though. The leader of the survivors who rescue you is a parkour instructor, and his free-running skills are part of the key to everyone's survival. Again, in a movie, pretty silly. Here, as a plot excuse for a game mechanic, it's genius. The zombies are both monsters and a navigational hazard, and you can run through, around, and even over the ravenous hordes without significantly risking your tender flesh. Hundreds of zombies in a parking lot below? Well, how about jumping from lamppost to lamppost? The animations are so fluid, and the action mapping for keeping momentum up is so intuitive that parkour in a city of zombies is a constant delight. I didn't ever get tired of it until the end, which features a mandatory and particularly hostile parkour course that I found incredibly frustrating to get the timing down of. In most of the game, besides optional parkour time trial challenges, parkour is used in a truly free-form way, a genuinely tactical mobility not found in most first-person games. Parkour even levels the player on a separate experience and ability track than performing combat actions. Of course, he'll get experience bonuses for combining parkour with a violent flourish, Combat is mostly melee weapons, which you can upgrade with scavenged components to create some fearsome-looking clubs and blades. It's a great call. Harran is a quarantined city. It only has what it started with in terms of weapons. You can get guns. There are more than a few scattered around. But they're really only as useful as your firing position. They're loud and attract more attention than you have bullets for most of the time. They're mostly for using on living opponents, and they're pretty unstoppable against live humans if you're aiming for the head with the same precision you aim for the heads of zombies. In later missions of the main campaign, and some of the side quests during the later phases of the game, Dying Light becomes a pretty straightforward first-person shooter. Use a pistol and a rifle to advance through a labyrinth of samey-looking hallways while collecting ammo from the soldiers you cut down. It's flat. It has nothing to do with zombies or Harran. They're just a bunch of bad guys because the game's mishmash of a plot says that they are bad guys who are mean and steal your things. So, time to Rambo it up. It's important to note that it isn't just a thematic disconnect. Gun mechanics fit in awkwardly with the game's usually very intense difficulty setting. Fighting humans is a piece of cake every time, especially later in the game, and that's just not the survival horror experience that the rest of the game is working so hard to create. It works 90% of the time, though. Imbalances in areas like firearms are particularly noticeable because Dying Light really is a well-balanced game, but it is entirely reliant on its game systems to engage the player. There's an incredible amount of genuine artistry in Dying Light's mechanical systems. Usually I talk about the art and architecture of a game being outside its systems, but not so with Dying Light. Here, the beautiful city and everything in it is a dynamic, moving part, like the player and the Horde. With the use of parkour, and especially later on with the grappling hook, every building is, in bouldering terms, a problem to be solved. Harran is one of the most impressive pieces of level design from the past couple years, in my opinion. The city feels completely naturalistic, but is also subtly designed to be tactically optimized for the game's parkour mechanics. You don't really notice until you gain some serious familiarity with the city, until you know what streets to go down, what escape routes are most common, but once you start crisscrossing your previous paths, the genius urban planning involved in Dying Light becomes clear. The architecture even reinforces the horror. Cramped warrens of dilapidated apartments, the bridge to nowhere crowded with cars and countless zombies, the tall tenement blocks with their gorgeous panorama views. The way the environment constructs tension is grounded in things like these. Harran is beautiful. Its architecture is beautiful. The beauty always has a purpose. As the light changes, it's pretty, but it's a major component of the horror mechanics. As you move from the slums to Old Town, it's a welcome aesthetic change, but it's also designed to challenge your grappling hook skills the same way the slums tested your climbing skills. The relationship of the player and the city, and the player and the zombie ecosystem, is what makes Dying Light so unique as a piece of zombie media. It accomplishes its horror as only games can, putting the player in charge of their own survival in a hostile world. Its failing is its reliance on Hollywood zombie movie cliches. For each moment of exuberant creativity in the city design, there's a moment of face-palming stupidity in the dialogue, which is too bad. Good characters and a meaningful script can create a wider range of horror than Dying Light, for all its competence, ever can. Telltale's Walking Dead is pretty much the design antithesis of Dying Light. It has no open world. In fact, the amount of actual level space in the game is incredibly minimal. The amount of gameplay is also minimal. The graphics are not technically impressive, although they are extremely charismatic. Instead of centering the horror on a reactive, player-first experience, you have a third-person, dialogue-based approach. Dying Light is the superior piece of software. In all ways, it is more technically remarkable. Yet The Walking Dead is ultimately a better piece of zombie media, through its story and the complexity of its characters and the depth of your choices in the narrative. It presents the horror of the zombie apocalypse in more ways than I could have come up with myself, and certainly more ways than Dying Light presents. The Walking Dead, both seasons, is one of the finest adventure titles of the past half-decade. Admittedly, the competition between adventure titles isn't stiff, but The Walking Dead was such a smash success for such obvious reasons that it really revitalized the adventure genre and made Telltale Games, its developers, a relatively household name in the gaming community. Adventure games are all puzzles and plot. That's what The Walking Dead is. Exploration puzzles, ethics puzzles, and combat that's really more of a violence puzzle than a system of combat like you'd see in the previous two games. The scope of how it engages with the apocalypse is also more impressive than the previous two games we've talked about. It begins on the day that the zombies rose and gets deeper and deeper into the post-apocalypse from there. It's a much slower burning plot than anything in the previous games we talked about, than most games actually outside the role-playing genre. A big reason for that is how faithful it is to its source material, taking the art style of the comics and blending it with the presentation techniques of the TV show. What makes The Walking Dead unique from either as a game is its branching choices. Rather than watch other characters struggle to make tough choices, the player bears the burden, and the plot stays the way you choose it through every consecutive episode. 2 full seasons of heartbreaking zombie nightmare, exactly as the player shapes it to be from moment to moment. It's quite an accomplishment. Individual episodes aren't significantly longer than those in Left 4 Dead 2, but good God, does an infinitely larger amount of stuff happen in them. In both previous games, zombies were the big problem. In The Walking Dead, the zombies are a big problem, sure, but they share the bill with mistrust and scarcity. You play as Lee Everett, a university professor recently sentenced to jail for a crime of passion. The first episode is all set up. Setting up Lee, setting up Lee's primary relationship, setting up the systems and rhythms of interaction that would become iconic signatures of a Telltale game. Episode 1 of the game is honestly a little awkward. It has clunky moments of meeting important franchise characters like Herschel before Rick reaches the farm and Glenn before Glenn heads into Atlanta. This is the weakest thing about the episode, these moments of franchise branding and name-dropping. It's the last episode to have this problem. Many of the other key members of the Survivor group make your acquaintance during the episode, though, most significantly Clementine, a little girl whose parents were away on vacation when the zombies rose. Children are an unusual presence in a serious, violent video game. In games that focus on gameplay systems, children are a drag. Nobody likes escort missions. There are exceptions, of course, like The Last of Us, but generally, it's quite difficult to work a kid into a game without the kid being a gameplay hassle and a narrative drag. Successful disaster plots involving children usually involve thinking selflessly, asking what you'd sacrifice on their behalf. Action games are very player-centric. Even BioShock doesn't actually penalize you that much for choosing to save little sisters, who just get at them at greater intervals. As a narrative-driven adventure game, The Walking Dead can explore themes of sacrifice and selflessness much more than an action game could. It makes more sense. It feels more natural. You're not thinking as player one, you're thinking about Lee Everett and what he might do. It's a tremendously important distinction, and Telltale's rhythm of interactive storytelling puts the player in that frame of mind relatively effortlessly. Lee and Clementine's relationship also introduces into the game one of the most powerful and unusual character arcs in the comics and the show, the arc tracing Rick and Carl's tumultuous dynamic. How can Rick strike a balance between protecting his son and demonstrating his humanity? How is this world changing Carl, who will never have a normal childhood? The Walking Dead game series mostly has characters and a plot completely independent of the show and the comic. Clementine coming under Lee's wing lets it hit some of the same story beats, in its own way. It's not just Clementine and the vulnerability she brings that makes this game unique. It's the vulnerability that everyone has. This isn't a game with health bars, and true to its source material, it's a game where not every survivor is actually suited to surviving. These are average people in your survivor group, average families. The Walking Dead has zombies, sure, but in plenty of ways, it's one of the least artificial game worlds out there. It doesn't just include what makes an entertaining game, it includes the full spectrum of human failure on top of the struggle and accomplishment that defined the previous 2 games. There's Kenny, Katya, and their son Duck. Katya's way out of her depth, and Kenny's got a hell of a temper. Later on, you'll meet Lily and Larry. Larry is one of the most interesting inclusions because he's a serious asshole, and he hates you so much. In an RPG, you almost never meet people who straight up don't like you, unless you're about to kill them and take their loot. Here, you've got to weigh your choices much more carefully. In the apocalypse, every living person matters. The help they can give matters. His daughter, Lily, shares a lot of his disposition and is fiercely loyal to him. Messing with Larry means messing with Lily, and that'll end badly for everyone. Lee's character fits into these sort of dilemmas in a particularly sharp way. His crime was murder. He killed the man his wife was having an affair with. Lee feels deeply ashamed about it, but in the heat of the moment, it is possible to push Lee too far. Will you, the player, let Larry push Lee that far? Or will you try to have patience and sympathy for someone who gives no indication that they will be anything other than mean as hell to you? This is, after all, the end of the world. Everyone's kinda tense. The opening of the second episode really brings home the difference between decision-making here and decision-making in other games. It's been a few weeks since everyone holed up in a motel that you cleared of walkers in the first episode. There are only 4 food items to go around to twice as many people. It's not about stats, or health, or stamina. It's about charity versus pragmatism. Will you feed the children and the vulnerable, or the able-bodied? Who will feel disrespected if you skip over them? Who will be understanding? Is it right to take advantage of that understanding disposition? It's not an easy choice. You're weighing personal ethics against gnawing hunger. Later on, the group winds up at a dairy where they settle in for a long-awaited meal. You know this one. You know how it ends. It's an obvious setup for cannibalism. But it's the best presentation I've seen in a game of cannibalism as a horror element. Consider Fallout 3's Andale. It's a similar cannibal-side story, but it's presented kinda awkwardly. A lot of sneaking around, a short confrontation, then a brief gunfight. In this game, Lee is the first to discover what's going on and bursts into the dining room just as Clementine's about to take a bite. In fact, if you're too slow coming back downstairs, Clementine will have already eaten one of your friends. Now comes a surprising dilemma. How do you get everyone to stop eating? I told them what I found. No one believed me. They kept on going. They were hungry. It's a moment of horror, but it's a moment of horror that arises from a crisis of dinner table etiquette. In an action game, it could never work. In a zombie adventure, it's effortless, brutal, and much more memorable than its very plotting, deliberate setup. Larry doesn't make it through episode 2, but it's alright, because dealing with Kenny explores the same constellation of ethical dilemmas without being quite so dramatic about it. At the end of episode 2, you come on something that seems like an incredible blessing. A quietly idling station wagon, full of food and other needed supplies. Kenny moves in to help himself. It seems like the obvious choice. And this is also a Player 1 kind of impulse. Compulsively loot everything. Only Clementine voices dissent. It's wrong. The owner could come back. After what happened at the dairy, doesn't that sound naive? Like the rules of a world that's receding into the past with every minute? So, is it better to help Clementine survive in this world, or help her hold on to the one that she knew? Over and over again, you'll be faced with loss, regret, and major, major mistakes. In fact, it's one of the only games I've ever played where I felt like my mistakes invested me more in the story than if I had done the correct thing, gone for the best outcome like you would in an RPG. Here, when I trusted the wrong person, I wanted that mistake to be canonical. Lily is a great example. After her father's death, she becomes increasingly paranoid. She blames this teenager you saved for a bandit attack that drives everyone from the hotel and back out onto the road at the beginning of episode 3. She confronts him with a pistol, and you, and another, depending on who you saved in the drugstore in episode 1. I was firmly convinced that I could talk her down, that everyone would see reason and get back in the RV, and we could continue. In the heat of her anger, she kills, in my case, Carly. Carly was great, nice, capable, very personable, a real survivor and a key member of the group. Dead in an instant. Not from zombies, but from murder. And that's another thing to point out. Murder loses meaning in games where killing is the principal interaction. Some games, like Spec Ops: The Line or Deus Ex, try to remind you that these little digital lives do matter and you should be more considerate about snuffing them out. In this game, violence is occasional and by no means your primary way of interacting. Your primary way of interacting is talking, getting to know these characters, their struggles, their strengths and weaknesses as both survivors and human beings. So, when one of your friends shoots another in cold blood, it's a genuinely shocking moment. It's not that games desensitize a person to violence, it's that games usually contextualize violence as at least somewhat frivolous. Here, it couldn't be more serious. Carly is dead, and you have to decide what to do about Lily. I tried to be merciful, and then she stole the fucking RV. And here's the kicker, she was right about that teenager. Ben's a coward, and a liar. As it goes on, The Walking Dead gets less and less predictable while it gets more and more compelling. What makes The Walking Dead great as a game and not just a story, though, is how it uses its moments of interactivity to great effect. The most memorable and heavy one in the game's first season is Duck's death. He gets bitten. Kenny and Katja don't know what to do, how to help, how to deal with the fact that there is no help. Katja shoots herself, rather than shoot her son, or witness anyone else shooting her son. Kenny turns to Lee for assistance. Will he, can he, shoot Duck before the kid turns? This moment is kinda old hat for the show and the comic, or plenty of other zombie movies, and there's even moments like it in action zombie games. But here, it's a lot different. You've gotten to know Duck pretty well over the 2.5 episodes by the time you reach this moment. Kenny's right there, paralyzed by grief. Meanwhile, what you've got is a pistol and this dying boy. I've been pulling the trigger in games since you used the control key to do it, and I've never had such a hard time killing something in a game. It's such a crazy, intense moment. Duck's breathing slows, then stops, and he kinda slumps. I chose to fire then. If I had waited much longer, Kenny would have had to see him turn on top of seeing his wife die right in front of him moments ago. Someone had to do it. Suppose it was Clementine, though. It could work out that way just as easily. The weight is felt more strongly than in a passive medium because the player picks the moment, and they're helpless against the passage of time and the progression of Duck's infection. That's the magic of it. By completely eschewing gameplay systems, each instance of interactivity is customized to the moment, sometimes to tremendous impact. Dying Light created horror systemically, and that's actually an amazing, difficult accomplishment. The Walking Dead uses interactivity like punctuation to the story that you influence but do not ultimately control. You're only responsible for Lee's actions. Everyone else is undependable. After Duck's death, Kenny becomes unhinged. He is in incredible pain. He's in incredible anger. Eventually it comes into a physical confrontation with Lee, and even then, you have choices. You can turn the other cheek for Kenny's sake to try to make him see what he's doing, before you absolutely have to fight back. And that's the other thing. The idea that no matter what, even in the face of the absolute worst and certain doom, you have meaningful choices about what kind of person you'll be. By the end of the 4th episode, Lee is bit, and Clementine's been kidnapped. You only have a little time, and you have to make the absolute most of it. A main character getting bit is another thing that happens in most zombie media. Usually it's not the main character. In Dying Light, your protagonist was bitten from the get-go, but it didn't become an issue until it was convenient for the plot. Here, it's a big deal. You have to decide if you want to tell everyone, and then you have to decide if you want your arm sawed off or not. Body horror is surprisingly hard to do in games. There's usually an intentional disconnect between you and the character on screen, but it can work occasionally. The Strogification scene in Quake 4 springs to mind. But Lee's arm getting sawn off here is particularly brutal, each cut tearing the camera's viewpoint jaggedly along with it. It has to be done, right? Clementine needs Lee more than Lee needs 2 zombie arms. And for the longest time, it holds. Enough time for Lee to track down Clementine, who's being held hostage by none other than the man whose station wagon you came across way back at the end of episode 2. He tells a fascinating story while holding Lee at gunpoint. He takes his own son out hunting and after things got bad and left him out there. When he returned to his family, they insisted they go back to look for him. That's when your group happens upon his station wagon. When he gets back to the car, there's mutiny. His wife hates him. She takes the rest of the family and they die on the road. He failed them. In Clementine, he sees a chance to start over. In Lee, he sees, at long last, someone he can actually feel superior to. In an amazing, unique conversation, the stranger throws all of Lee's decisions back in his face. I've never had a hostile retelling of my entire litany of decisions in a game before, but you get one in The Walking Dead Season 1. It ties together all 5 episodes so neatly, I couldn't even believe it. I invested 48 hours in Dying Light. I invested 10 in The Walking Dead. But when I think of zombies, it's these things that stick with me so much more than the blur of carnage and crafting, however fun in the moment, that makes up Dying Light. Dying Light's a great game, but so is this. And this has both the game design and the dialogue to make it work. Clementine is the one who shoots the stranger eventually. The world that she inherits will be one of violence and blood, and here she is, plunging in headfirst to save Lee. It's both touching and awful at once. And the episode gets more tragic from there. Lee is dying. He's weak. Too weak to actually accomplish the quick-time events and other sharp use of interactivity to intensify emotional investment. All that's left is to say goodbye. And you have choices in that as well. We don't have to watch Lee die together in this video. It's impossibly sad to witness and difficult to play. But it stands as such a bold bit of video game storytelling, confidently brutal, intensely personal. The Walking Dead as a franchise has story beats that are all about the deaths of beloved characters. A game without would be flat by comparison. Making the player experience their own character's slow death, though, that takes commitment to your narrative vision. The commitment pays off. Clementine is missing from 400 Days, the DLC for Season 1, but 400 Days continues to experiment with the form and function of this new variety of adventure game very charismatically. Instead of a single linear story, there are 5 short vignettes taking place over the course of the first 400 days of the apocalypse. You play stories at the beginning of the outbreak, like a prisoner on a bus who has to decide which of the other inmates around him get eaten, and there are stories deep into the apocalypse, like a woman trying to decide if a stranger who broke into their camp should be set free or executed. Each is a sharp portrait of people in various states of practical and ethical crisis. Each continues the incredibly immersive blend of rolling dialogue, punctuated by heavy, important moments of interaction. At the end of the DLC, a woman comes to offer everyone sanctuary. Based on how you guided them through their experiences, characters will choose to trust her or not. The thing is, when you play the second season of the game, everyone who goes along with her is cast as a villain. Clementine is eventually made prisoner in the community that adopts all these folks, and you see them in the background throughout that episode of the second season. If you hadn't played 400 Days, they're just that, background characters. If you had, you know them as people, fallible people, who make terrible mistakes and then have to live with them. In an action zombie game, living with the dead is all you have to worry about. In a serious zombie adventure, living with your choices can be the harder thing by far. In the interest of time balance between the segments of this video, I won't be covering the second season of the game in detail. It puts the players in Clementine's shoes the whole time, though. It's funny, when Lee was my character, I played as Lee, but throughout the second season I kept asking myself, what would Lee say? His impact on the story and on the player lingers for a long time. It's not the zombies themselves that define a zombie game. It's what kind of horror the game designers want to create. Do you want to fight infinite waves of mindless dead with other real people so you can experience the bonds of the survivor group personally? Do you want a whole necropolis to explore, to test your survival skills against a wide-open world that wants your tender flesh? Or do you want to explore what it means to hold on to your humanity in the face of endless, hopeless death? You can have your brain and eat it too. Games are delightfully flexible that way. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching. I'd like to take the time to thank by name some of the people who are currently donating $10 or more a month to me on Patreon. If it wasn't for the crowdfunding website, I wouldn't be able to make these videos. I rely on these people's generosity. People like Cameron Jackson, Cassie, Comfy Hat, Ron Gervais, Christian Zacharianson, Pat Hay, Soeb Sheik, Boulder Carlson, Dennis Clark, Maxwell Reed, Nick Cole Hamilton, Andrew Folt, Kevin DeBolt, Jake Brown, Ken Young, Dalton Seiler, Igor Babiuk, Niles D. McDonald, Seth Downing, Justin Hughes, Kumaran Vijayan, Nobody, Jared Meyer, Philip Martheron, Dylan Sibley, David Fry, David Reed, Josh, Boris Nielsen, Michael Atwell, Eugene Watson, Cameron, Alexander Leister, David Gilbreth, Truls Katzberg Sigvert, I Cannot Fly, Wesley M., Aaron Albeck, B-Tree, Alexander Heavens, Noah Dugars, Martin Karsten, Galak, Brett Gialmo, Martin Sconning, Finn Spencer, Andreas Larson, Lars Ingvar Anderson, Colin, Brad Carr, Ivan Martin, Josh Farks, Chris Larkey, Aiden AK-47, Dan Reeder, Dewey, Anax Rhodes, Niels Bachfrummer, Spyro Sedaris, Rob Clark, Matthew Lagden, Harley McAvoy, Jump Kick Punch, Carl Gleason, Tim Marsh, Joshua Vivi, Tyser Vicarian, Irvin, Brad Smith, Connor Biblo, Ryan Gunst, Preston Allen, Sigmund Kopperud, Stephen Lark, Amer Aguilar, Jeffrey Knudsen, Pontus Pfaffenstill, D. Kimmo Heikkinen, Joe Wolf, Sangustin, Oliver Handliken, White Zero, Stephen Rubio, Yuri Petnes, Sill, Jonathan Fleichener, and many others. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, and thanks for watching.